Lake Effect brings you conversations about what's happening in Milwaukee and the people, places, and organizations that shape the community. This is Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.
A Brady List is a list of law enforcement officers with credibility concerns. Officers can be on the list for a variety of reasons: a history of dishonesty, criminal convictions, or other concerns. The list is meant to help people who've been accused of a crime. Among other things, it can be a reference for a lawyer to learn whether or not a police witness has credibility to testify against a defendant. Recently, Milwaukee County released their Brady List of nearly 200 names. Investigative reporter Ashley Luthern joins WUWM's Jimmy Gutierrez to share about her reporting, which is featured in today's Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel.
What is the Brady List, and why wasn't it public in the first place?
The Brady List is a list of officers, law enforcement personnel who are known to have documented credibility issues. It's a list that's historically been maintained by the DA's office, and they maintain it to fulfill what are called Brady obligations. Brady obligations are anything really that could help a person prove their innocence when they are charged with a crime. It's a requirement under the U.S. legal system that prosecutors provide this information. And it's a wide range. Brady material encompasses a wide range of potential evidence. What we are specifically talking about are pieces of evidence that relate to credibility, because oftentimes officers, specifically police officers, are the key witnesses in criminal prosecutions.
Thinking of that then in the relationship to the Brady List, to the district attorney's office, what was it like to get that information from the DA's office?
This project is undertaken with media partners, including Wisconsin Watch and WTMJ Channel 4. Wisconsin Watch last year published a really great report that showed how inconsistent Brady Lists are maintained by district attorneys' offices across the state. So in all 72 counties, you have different ways of prosecutors maintaining that information, disclosing it. Some said they had no officers on the list. Others said that they didn't maintain a list at all. Others did furnish a list. One of those who provided a list at the time was Milwaukee County. However, it was only officers who had been criminally charged or convicted of a criminal offense. Brady material can include any documented instance of credibility concerns, and so that would also include internal violations. So in Milwaukee County, they also had a subset of this list that they had withheld from the public for quite a while that related to internal violations of officers. Now, to be clear, the DA's office said they always would provide that information to defense attorneys when those officers were involved in cases. They maintained very strongly that they have always fulfilled their Brady obligations. For us as reporters and members of the public, we weren't sure who was on it. And frankly, neither, in some cases, were the officers. So those two groups, the defense attorneys and the police unions, both are quite concerned about the standards that are used to have people placed on the list, how long people stay on the list, if there's ever an opportunity for officers to contest their placement on the list, and from the defense attorney's perspective, referring information to the prosecutors that they turn up in their own investigations on behalf of their clients that they feel goes to credibility. In Milwaukee County, the district attorney's office maintains that anytime we get new information, we review it and we determine if it is appropriate for an officer to be added to the Brady List or to possibly be removed. But for a long time, it's been difficult for people to even know what this list is or who's on it when part of it has always been withheld. And part of the reason it's been withheld is because the DA's office maintained that those internal violations related to public records that were not in their purview. So if an officer had been criminally charged with an offense, a prosecutor would be issuing that charge. If they had been internally disciplined, that's coming from their own agency. However, our point as media organizations was those are all public records. And so when the DA's office did finally release their full Brady List in September of last year, they released it with a lot of caveats, one of them being they couldn't guarantee the accuracy of all the information on the list. And that included whether officers were still employed with those agencies, that included whether or not they had been convicted of specific offenses. And so my colleagues at TMJ and Wisconsin Watch and I, we spent 5 months requesting records underlying all of these officers, comparing it with past media coverage to really try to figure out how these people ended up on the list.
Can I ask you about the last 5 months then? Because it feels like putting together that list and then doing all the shoe leather reporting that you all have been doing, I'm sure that you found some things that maybe surprised you or maybe about the process that surprised you. So what did you find on the list, and have you heard anything from officials?
I think what surprised us was how inconsistent it was. At least 5 officers on the list were now deceased. They'd been deceased for quite a while, so that raised questions for us as to how often this information is reviewed, kind of independently by the DA's office. There was an officer who was listed as having been involved with a custody death. He was not. We found no evidence that he had been involved with that. He had a different kind of integrity concern, but not a custody death, as was listed on the DA's list. At least 2 officers were listed with the wrong agencies. And some of this might sound a little nitpicky to some, but this is a public record that is critically important to ensuring people have a fair trial. Because ultimately what this all is about is that there is enough information for someone to consider their defense because they are facing a loss of their liberty. You know, they are facing possible incarceration time if they are charged with a crime. And just because an officer's on the Brady List doesn't mean that that information automatically comes into a courtroom. There's still other layers of review. A defense attorney has to look at it and say, this actually might help in this specific case. And then if they decide that, they have to take it to a judge. And then a judge decides if it's relevant or not. But none of that can happen unless there is an adequate record of these integrity concerns that are raised in the first place. It's sort of like trying to know an unknown. You have to have the information as a starting point.
Thinking of credibility concerns and officers often being the primary witness to X, Y, or Z happening, I guess I'm curious, how can officers still be employed or employable if they're on the Brady List, if they have these credibility concerns that would jeopardize their ability to do their job and to appear in a courtroom?
We asked Police Chief Jeff Norman and Sheriff Danita Ball what they would say to community members who are concerned about people being on the Brady List and currently still being employed with their agencies. As best we can tell, again, with the public records we were able to obtain and answers from these different agencies, about 24 officers who are on the list, and there are about 190 or so, remain employed as law enforcement officers in Milwaukee County. And the response from the police chief and the sheriff was, people can make a mistake. The Brady List does appear to encompass quite a wide range of behavior. You know, for example, there's an officer who's listed who cheated on an exam by writing on his hand. That goes to integrity. Does that mean that person can never serve as a police officer, right? At the far, far end of the other spectrum are the officers who were federally convicted of civil rights crimes for beating Frank Jude. So huge spectrum of conduct there. And obviously those Frank Jude officers have long not been employed. And from the perspective of law enforcement, what they were explaining to us is that they weigh each individual case. They look at the seriousness of the infraction. In the case of Chief Norman, he looks at an officer's work history. He looks at the facts of the current case. He looks at similar discipline, and he gets input from the rest of his command staff before he makes a discipline decision. If the district attorney's office were to tell him, he said, that an officer's testimony would never be used, in that case, he said he would have no choice but to make sure that that person was no longer with the agency. That situation, sometimes referred to as being giglioed, that's named after another Supreme Court case, happens pretty rarely, according to District Attorney Kent Lovern. He said in his recollection, in the past 18 years, there maybe were 3 people who he would consider he would absolutely never call them to testify, and they all have not been in law enforcement for many, 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 many years.
I mean, I know you've been covering crime and public safety for a long time in the city, but you also were working with, as you said, TMJ and then Wisconsin Watch out of Madison. What was the dynamic of that group process to come together and sift over all of this information, all these documents over the last 5 months and what we see now in this reporting?
I think this process has shown the power of collaboration. We all tell stories in slightly different ways. Certainly TV is a very different format. And it really was helpful to have so many people reviewing information and going off and getting public records. I mean, we were getting records from police agencies, from courthouses. We were looking up old archival newspaper coverage, TV coverage, and going through hundreds and maybe even thousands of pages of records. And to do that in a relatively short amount of time, I would say 5 months, is only possible when you have other people working on it with you.
What do you expect to come after this reporting, and what can we expect from your reporting?
I want to be very clear that District Attorney Kent Lovern has been very open to receiving the information that we provided. As a result of the information and questions that we raised, he ultimately removed 7 people from the Brady List. He also notably said that there was an individual who we brought to his attention who should have been placed on the Brady List years earlier. And because of that, his office is currently reviewing any case in which that officer was a state's witness. And anyone who's convicted in those cases, they are now notifying that individual and their attorney so that they can decide if that factors into any further litigation they want to undergo. By the same token, you'll see in further reporting, we have found other cases where officers have been deemed to have lied or not told the whole truth when they were in court, in a civil proceeding or a criminal proceeding. And some of those officers are not on the list. And the district attorney has held firm in his decision on that. So we'll be exploring that in further articles. And so I expect a conversation about what the purpose of this list is, how it's maintained, and if there should be broader standards, not just in Milwaukee County, but statewide, for how this information is compiled, who is placed on a list, and how it is ultimately presented to the public.
Ashley Luthern is an investigative reporter with the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. She spoke with WUWM's Jimmy Gutierrez.
You can find more interviews like this one by visiting wuwm.com/Lake Effect. And while you're there, subscribe to the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast.